Welcome to Platemark. This is Anne Shafer, your host. You're joining us for Series 2, Episode 15 on non-religious or secular prints, dating to the early part of the 1500s when Martin Luther created the schism between the Catholic Church and what would become the Protestant Church. When Tru and I started talking about secular prints, we went on for a very long time, so I split them up. This is part 2 of that conversation. And in this one, we'll talk more about Martin Luther, of course, but we will focus on works of art by Hans Holbein, the younger, and Lucas Cranach, the elder. We're jumping in right in the middle. I put some preamble in the front to lay out the situation again, so it might sound a little bit familiar, but hopefully that will help set the scene. So here we go. Welcome to Platemark. This is Series 2, A History of Western Printmaking. I'm here with my esteemed colleague, Tru Ludwig. We are up north to the northern climes of Germany and Flanders. Before we get to that, I'm going to do my positionality. I identify as a cishet white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her.
I identify as a gay white trans man, and I use the pronouns he, him.
We are recording this at the Purple Crayon Press in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people.
We're going to be talking about non-religious prints in the north of the Alps. As we move in towards secular, meaning non-sacred, or things that are withdrawn from the temporal world, or genre scenes from everyday life, or things that are just not faith-based. However, today, we're also going to see something that sort of crosses the line. We're going to be dealing with imagery that was generated in response to the Reformation. And Martin Luther, I'm wildly impressed by what Martin Luther accomplished. He's frustrated with the Catholic Church because the entirety of the European continent is under the sway of the Catholic Church, the structure that's been in place hundreds and hundreds of years. The church has been perverted by all these levels and layers of hierarchy that aren't attending to people's needs and rituals and things that had nothing to do with what the Bible, that your relationship with the Lord was being monitored by an enormous machine that went back hundreds of years. Think about one guy having had it and writing up his 95 theses and nailing them to the door of the Wittenberg Church on October 31st, 1517. That was the official beginning of the Protestant Reformation, the reforming of the church, the people that are protesting the way the Catholic Church has been behaving. And so Luther says, you got to get rid of all of that stuff. You don't need anybody. You don't need popes. You don't need our bishops. You don't need any of that. You don't have to pay any money of that. All of it comes from this one place. It all comes from the Bible. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was God. It's between you and the book and your God. And you don't need anybody else to interpret that for you. And in so doing, you don't need to have a whole bunch of images distract you when you're doing these things. Now, the last person I want to talk about would be Lucas Cranach, the elder, who had done at least 50 painted portraits of Luther, not to mention woodcuts and engravings of him. And I started thinking about people who change history and the importance of the image of a person. And it made me realize that in one respect, you have Martin Luther. When I show the students and I start talking about the Reformation, the image I always put up is, you have to imagine that it's art in the dark, and I'm in a classroom with students that may or may not know anything about church history, and I put up a slide that looks like this, and Anne's going to describe it for me.
Okay, well, this is one of the PowerPoint presentation slides, and the main image is of Tiananmen Square with the gentleman standing in front of the tanks.
The Tank Man.
The Tank Man. To the left, that's Martin Luther, a portrait by Cranach. And on the upper right, it looks like the Pope.
And that's Pope Leo X.
Okay.
You remember when Tiananmen Square was going down. And when you see the Tank Man picture, there are these 4 enormous tanks trundling down the street. And there's a guy that had just come from buying his groceries. And he walks out in the street and he's had it. And he stands there with his 2 little plastic bags of groceries. And he won't move. And this whole convoy of tanks is halted. The tank goes, and tries to go, and it can't go anywhere. But what you don't realize is that if you pan out, the line of tanks goes way back. And I always think about this one person that could stop a system And I think about Martin Luther doing exactly that. Because here is an Augustinian monk who has been trained, he knows things, but this unrest, this frustration on the part of the population saying, there are these branches of the Catholic Church, they're not paying attention to me, I can't get at my local clergyman. And the worst part, the part that Luther would have really just be most disgusted by, was that the popes were not paying attention to poping. They were too busy on building campaigns or being too busy in politics. If you think about Pope Julius II, who had decided, hey, it's time to rebuild old St. Peter's. He started doing that in 1502. He was called the warrior pope. He physically himself was out on the battlefield. He then starts this whole rebuilding of the St. Peter's that we see today. How do you finance something like that? You're going to need to get the money from someplace. You go to your confessional, and if you're really lucky, instead of having to just be penitent, you could get an indulgence. An indulgence is something that you could buy from your local clergy that is, I say it as get out of hell free. You're essentially buying your way into heaven. You pay money, you get this piece of paper that says, you're absolved. Mm-hmm. It's okay. And Martin Luther is so disgusted by that he even decries that and 94 other things. Because in 1517, he writes down his objections to the Catholic Church. I think it's so ballsy. This is where it excites me to think about one guy having had it and writing up his 95 theses and nailing them to the door of the Wittenberg Church on October 31st, 1517. That was the official beginning of the Protestant Reformation. And so Luther says, you got to get rid of all of that stuff. You don't need anybody else to interpret for you. You don't need to have a whole bunch of images distract you. And
the power of images to tell the story, that's the thing that is a little counterintuitive for me.
Indeed. But watch the images tell the story. Because let's talk about another German artist, Hans Holbein the Younger. Well, Hans Holbein the Younger was living and working in Basel, and he was with a bunch of other people that were catching on to this new Reformation idea in the 1520s. He gets wind of this Luther guy, and he's really intrigued by this, and he comes up with an image which I just adore. Now, again, we talk about Martin Luther, and then we think about other people that change history and speak for the underserved. And then you just add King to the name Martin Luther, and then you suddenly, oh, it has relevance to today. Well, the next thing I'll do is put the same picture up there of Pope Leo X that was painted by Raphael. And then you have Luther, who's just this humble, Augustinian, well-educated monk. And next to him, I have a picture of Rosa Parks. What's the thing? What did she say? You got to leave your seat. And she said, no. And here we are today. We're still fighting some of the same stupid battles. But that's what Luther had done. Making it relevant. When he did that, he essentially split all of the European continent in two, ultimately. And so the Catholic countries are going to do what they do, and they're going to have one set of representation because the beautiful artwork is supposed to, make the whole event of the service come alive for you in Italy and in France and certainly in Spain. But the followers of Luther in most of Germany and Switzerland, Basel, and Holland, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia, and then England. England had been Catholic until
King Henry decided to divorce his wife.
Yeah, he wanted his marriage annulled, which I think is interesting because at this time we have a young up-and-comer named Hans Holbein who's interested in all of this new stuff that's going on, and he does a woodcut in 1519. It blows my mind, and it's called Hercules Germanicus. Put your cheaters on and tell me about this scene.
Let's see. So there's a central figure in a monk's robe with a spiked, what do you call those things? A pike. No, not a pike.
A mace, I think.
A mace. He's got a mace overhead, and he's about to beat somebody who he's got also by the neck with his other hand. And there's a tree behind them with a little plaque, and then lots of people on
the bottom.
Yeah, he's beating all sorts of people.
Oh, indeed. He's bashing them mercilessly. Hercules Germanicus. Who's the modern Hercules? Remember Hercules killing the Lernaean Hydra?
Right.
Well, here's Hercules Germanica, and he's cutting off the various evil heads of this
The Catholic
beast,
Church.
the beast, right? And his slain victims on the ground include Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, William of Ockham, and Peter Lombard. You'll also see someone wearing a papal tiara, and they're all named, and they are Catholic leaders. And he's clubbing them down because he's the modern Hercules. And one source, I think of it as a lion skin, but one source said that that's not the lion skin, which is what Hercules wears. That's his attribute. It's the skin of a flayed pope.
Really?
I don't think that's that. I think it's a lion skin. But here's a guy in his early 20s. This is an incredibly adept image. It's cinematic if you think about it. It's got violence, it's got diagonals, it's got all of this going, and they're well arranged, and I get a pretty clear picture of what's happening here. Right? And that, to me, is an homage to someone that he believes in mightily. He's in Basel, the center of this new Reformation idea. And then he comes up with this next thing, a series of woodcuts that he designs, 1523 to 26. He's still in Basel, which is one of the hot spots where iconoclasm is going through. Basel, Strasbourg, and Wittenberg, and one other place in Germany literally go through phases of iconoclasm because of what Luther has said, which is all of those images, all of those crucifixes, all of those sculptures, all of those paintings that are in the churches are graven images. You're worshiping them like idols. And Luther doesn't think you should have them. And so this period of iconoclasm, people image destroy, iconoclasm, a cataclysm. They're destroying images. They're smashing windows. This continues into the 1560s. It's interesting to read the sources when they're talking about how the painters are like, well, what am I supposed to do? Literally, they don't know what they're going to do because the church was their gravy train.
Right.
What else am I supposed to make? And it's interesting that Holbein designs this cycle of minuscule prints like our friend Recht Altdorfer, just 10 years later, but now they're not Christian scenes. This is all a series that we now call the Dance of Death. And it's 40 little bitty engravings that show death, the skeleton, coming to all different kinds of people. And so he may be tearing away at a clergyman and ripping them off, or it could be, I love how death is coming up beside the nun and whispering in her ear. And death is coming to the Pope as he sits on his throne. Death comes to everyone. The one where death comes along and he's up right along with the old plowman in the field, but he's taking the reins of the horses and helping lead them, as though he's saying, I'm relieving you of the strain of this hard life you've had to live. It is indeed mocking the Catholic Church. I mean, here's death standing right behind the Pope going, right. There's 40 of these little bitty things. When they were initially printed, they were separate sheets. Eventually, by 1538, somebody put them all into book form. The version that I would show the students at the Peabody Library was published in 1541. They could hold this book, which is the size of a nice little penguin book, and you could look through this, and you, the viewer, could see these tiny little woodcuts that would show you death comes to everyone, and the good or the bad or all of those in between. And it was the first time we'd seen something like that in print. It picked up a theme from medieval times of how death is the great leveler. And some of them are pretty grisly, but they're so remarkable. Another thing I wanted to bring to Anne's attention is that when we went to Paris to work on the Hader project, and the place we were staying, remember when we looked down on something? What was that?
Yeah, we rented an apartment, I forget where, the 9th or 10th maybe, and it was on the top floor of the building, and when you look down the street perpendicular, across the middle of the block was a police van because they were guarding the offices of the Charlie Hebdo newspaper where they had just had that massacre.
Yes, of 12 people, cartoonists, people that used a pencil.
Political cartoonists.
Yeah. I found somebody that said that Holbein was the Charlie Hebdo of his day. this could have gotten him killed, but he was working in Basel, so it was okay. And eventually they got published. Things got so bad with this iconoclasm that he has to leave his wife and 2 kids, so he goes to England twice. The thing that also blows my mind is that his letter of introduction to Sir Thomas More in England was from Erasmus of Rotterdam.
Oh my gosh.
There were those that say that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched, because he was another one that said all of these kinds of reforms need to be made in the church. So Holbein goes off to England, and he, eventually we'll see him paint the French ambassadors, and he'll paint Henry VIII, who becomes the head of the church in England because they're Anglican, because they're not going to be Catholic, because he wanted to get rid of his first wife. It blew my mind the first time I realized that Holbein had done these kinds of images. That's so ballsy for a guy in his 20s. He stuck by his guns and then said, I can't stay here. It's too dangerous. So he has to go off to England and continues to do his job of showing what the new things should be. So there's that. I wanted to bring that to your attention. The idea of memento mori being brought forward. And that is a reflection of many of the things that Martin Luther put in place, saying that you can't have these images. The other thing that Luther would say is, if you're going to make images of or from the Bible, they have to really be true to the text of the Bible. Go back to the thought that when Luther nails these 95 Theses to the church door, 1517, and eventually he is on the run for his life. He's been excommunicated in 1521 by the Pope, and then Charles V puts out this Diet of Worms that says you can kill him anywhere you find him. The painting that I have up on the screen was painted by Cranach, and it shows Luther with this weird beard because he's disguised as the knight Junker Jorg. And he has to literally skitter around, and eventually he gets safely ensconced at Wartburg and translates the Bible from Latin into German, the language of the people who can read it themselves. And I just love that he's using the fact that people can read, they're learning to read. He's using the print media. He's got Cranach, who's cranking out these portraits of him, which I just think are astonishing, because the spin doctors are able to make portraits of Luther that, let's say, Hans Baldwin gives us this portrait of Luther as a man of the people. Tell me what you see in this portrait of Luther.
Well, it's a 3/4 bust, and he's holding a book open, so that must be the Bible.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And then he's got this pretty organic halo around his head and a dove flying just above his head.
Yep. But look, he's got his grub.
He's got stubble.
He's a man of the people. He's not completely removed. And somebody else will come along and turn that into an engraving, so that they're appealing to these different class structures. And here's your leader. This is the guy who's going to let you have your way and do what you need to do. And Luther's smart enough to create these things called Flugschrift, which are one-page things that you could print and throw out there. They're leaflets.
Broadsides.
Yeah, or littler things even.
Little.
And they even have a couple of those in the Peabody Library. One of them shows the Pope with a rat face and ass ears. This is how you can get people's attention. They can read it. They can read the word. They can see the pictures. And then the Bible's in a language they can understand. To me, that's just brilliant.
That's radical.
Oh my God. Of course, you could get killed. He survived, and he changed Western history.
Yes, he did.
So when I show you something and it says, what's the single most important thing in the history of the West, it'll be a picture of Luther.
And the printing press.
And the printing press, yes. So that to me is thrilling. So the idea of how do we use the print, and then how do we make issue with it? Well, Holbein shows us the Dance of Death. Cranach, another German, who was so close to Luther that they were godparents for each other's kids.
Oh, wow.
They were that close.
Wow.
We're talking now about Lucas Cranach the Elder, who would give us images that would show the law of grace. Oh, here's one of my faves. In 1521, he's putting out these images that show Christ and the Antichrist. I'm showing a pair of woodcuts that show Christ washing the feet of the disciples. So it's very Christian. And the Antichrist there's the Pope with people coming and kneeling and handing him coins. There's this whole concept of Christ and the Antichrist, and that's being used with great abandon. And then we get these kinds of woodcuts too. This is the two ways of looking at faith. And you got to put your cheaters on.
No, I can't.
Can you really see this?
I can.
Okay.
All right. So, oh gosh, I thought it was two compositions. There's a
But it is.
right. There's a tree that separates two halves of an image, and on the left, there is that Adam? Who is that running out of?
Somebody damned.
Well, he's somebody damned.
Oh, there's Adam and Eve back up there.
Oh,
They're under the tree because
right.
they did the. So they sinned, and now. Then we have to have, what's this going on right here?
Oh, that's the
Ten Commandments. Yeah, you have to live by the commandments, right? It's the Catholic Church. You got to live by the commandments.
Oh, it's death chasing this guy off.
Yeah, and where's he going to go?
Into the maw of hell.
Because he didn't make it to what? What's up there in the sky?
The circle of heaven with the orb and Christ sitting on it.
Which is the last judgment.
The last judgment.
He didn't make it because he didn't.
I see.
Right? Now, if you bought an indulgence, you would have been able to get up there. Right? But here we have Christ at the last judgment in heaven, and on his right-hand side is the Virgin, and on the left-hand side is John the Baptist. And he's up in that pie crust cloud, and you've got that hierarchy, and then the next level you got Adam and Eve, and then you got Moses, and it's like, oh, you didn't do it right. Now off he gets chased. Look how busy that composition is.
I lost death there for a minute.
Yeah, because there's all these levels and layers of stuff. Notice that the tree is dead, and the tree on the right side, not the sinister side, the sinistre, but on the right side is
full of leaf.
Okay, so now we have a completely different way of talking about a system of faith.
It looks like the naked guy has a direct line to Christ on the cross.
Yeah.
And is that Moses telling him?
Well, here's the deal. So see all these things you have to do to get to heaven in the Catholic Church? Well, here, you're saved if you have faith. You may have done terrible things in your life, but if you have faith and you believe in the Lord with your heart, you will be saved. Christ was crucified for your sins, and for that you receive grace. And you see the Spirit raining down from him. The blood of Christ saves him. And here comes Christ out of the tomb going, it's all okay. It's okay if you have faith.
I see.
And you believe in the book. And so Luther said, get rid of all those sacraments. We're only going to keep baptism and communion. And he says, we're not going to pay attention to all those saints that the Catholics were doing. We're going to keep a couple like St. Mark and St. Paul. And he really strips it down. Visually, we get to see this stuff that Cranach is doing. And these are the kinds of images that you get to see a whole bunch of. Print is used as a tool. I have to show you a couple of things. We have our Hercules Germanicus. We have the down to earth Luther. We have the proper engraved Luther. We have different views of how the church operates. It's cartooning, if you will, but it's also mocking and wonderful of showing how complex the Catholic Church is. And yet also prints could be used to, what do you see in this one? I'm just curious to.
Well, Luther as a wolf in the fold is the title. So
there's Luther looking like a good man of God, right? But if you lift his robe, you see he's got wolf. He's
wolf feet.
Yeah, he's wolf in sheep's clothing, and the naughty little devil.
Oh, interesting.
So they're showing that he's a dangerous person, right? Or they would show an image of Luther and a nun, and they're trick cards, and they would flip them up, and they're their genitals. Oh. You know why?
Because they're bad people?
Because they don't believe in the celibacy of church officials. So they must be wrong. And so there were these kinds of propaganda things. I just am amazed. It's church related, but that's pretty secular if you really think about it. It's humorous, but also terrifying. Here's a great image that was also put out there. This is another flip card where you see a picture of the Pope and he's yelling. He's got the papal tiara on, but you flip it up and underneath you can see that people are being lashed to a post and they're being persecuted because they're heretical. They're Protestants.
Gotcha.
When Luther translates the Bible into German, it gets published in 1522 in German. And I really wanted to show you two things that I find astonishing. So Lucas Cranach the Elder is the one that is closest to Luther. He does illustrations for the Bible that Luther publishes. There's a version of the Bible.
Why would he have illustrations?
Well, that's a great question. Luther said it was okay if you did images that adhered to the text and they were for teaching purposes. But if these are study aids, right? And Luther also said that you had to really adhere to the text. So Cranach goes back and he uses the style of Dürer. He renders it much more adherent to the text. So here you see St. John kneeling before God the Father, and whose head has become light. Here he's sleeping as
the from the Apocalypse.
Yeah.
Right.
And here he's asleep, and God is completely turned into the sun because it follows the text specifically.
In the Chronik.
In the Chronik, right. Correct. So it was another propaganda thing. There were no other images in the Bible except the last book, the Revelation of St. John. That's the only one book. At the very end, that's the one that shows the end of the world. Luther publishes that Bible in 1522. And a wonderful thing we get to do when I take them up to the Garrett Museum and Library, I'm sorry, this just thrills me to no end. The volume of the Bible that's printed in September gives us an image of one of the plates that I think is quite... Remember I told you Cranach had made images of the Christ and the Antichrist. The Pope is the Antichrist. And the Catholic Church itself was referred to as the Whore of Babylon by Luther. Yeah. Well, so here we have the Whore of...
September
1522.
1522, the Bible.
Correct. And Cranach does this image of the Whore of Babylon riding on a seven-headed beast. And it's the end of time. And you can see all these people all very worried. And just look at her. And what do you get any sense of what's happening there at all?
Well, these all look like the beasts out of St. Anthony's torment.
You're right. And those are 7 kings, the perversions, the fornication, all these other things. And then look at the woman astride the horse.
Well, she looks pretty placid.
Yeah.
And she's wearing the 3-tiered tiara.
Plus, it's a little crooked on her head. And she's got a chalice and a goblet, kind of like the one in Nemesis. Well, this is in September of 1522.
Right.
And it all refers to when it talks about, come and I will show you the judgment of the great whore who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and with the wine of whose fornication the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk. That's her, right? This is all in the book of Revelations. So he carried me away to the spirit in the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had all 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with golden jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her fornication.
Gracious.
And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon, the great mother of whores and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. This is the end of time.
Good God.
All right. This was 1522. Right. This is the freaking end of the world, right? And so Cranach has given us this image. You just showed the Catholic Church as the Whore of Babylon wearing the papal tiara. So it's time to make a reprint in December. And I'm going to show Anne the December version of the 1522 Bible. And Cranach went back into the plate. What do you see?
Oh, her tiara is down to 1 level, not 3.
Hey, look at it. He just had to carve
He just took it right off.
Had to carve it right out of the block. To stay alive, to maybe not die.
Wow.
The Whore of Babylon, and there she is.
Wow.
It's just to see how strong this use of image can be. This is politics. This isn't the Bible.
Right.
It's really trying to state a claim. How we use these images and how powerful they can be and how they can be used to change history. I just get a tremendous kick out of that. Maybe we could close with them seeing what Lucas Cranach's son, Lucas Cranach the Younger, gives us one final vision of the difference between the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church. Here comes the gift of grace coming down from heaven, and Luther is praying, and people are listening, and there's no distractions because they're listening to the word, and they know that Christ, died for your sins. And in the Catholic side, you can see that there's all of these. You have to pay your money. You have to go in. You have to talk to somebody. There's a devil talking in the ear of the archbishop. And then you go up there and then to heaven, and there's somebody appreciating the saints. And it's just as snarky as it can possibly be.
Wow.
That would hold through the remainder of the century. So there you have it. The idea of witches and all of these things that could change us because we're weak individuals. But we also have all of these new kinds of things that because we can't depict crucifixions, but you could have portraits, Luther, all the great thinkers of the time, Erasmus or Thomas More. You could have classical stories like the labors of Hercules or Old Testament things like Joseph and Potiphar's wife doing the nasty, or you could have genre scenes of milkmaids, or you could have pleasant little things that could delight a person who would be collecting prints. It completely changed the market and how prints would be distributed and sold. It became for everybody, and you could read the good book yourself. You didn't have to be told by the church what to think. It was go into your closet and pray, and your connection with the Lord is direct. And you can look at these other images and you won't worship those false idols. So, okay, thanks, Martin. You did a great job.
It's a sea change.
It completely. And I think about the media campaign he used with print.
Right.
One last thing that's so fascinating. In 2017, it was the 500th anniversary of nailing those 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church. There was a fantastic, massive exhibition that went to all of these wonderful places. It was at the Morgan Library. Mm-hmm. And of course, it was the Minneapolis Institute of the Arts, because that's in Minnesota, which is where St. Olaf College is, and which is also where there's a lot of Lutherans. Right. And this is, I think, a great way to close. Luther, he's long dead by the time this image is made. But remember that Luther translated the Bible into the language of his people, the Germans. And St. Jerome, back in 386, had translated the Bible into the language of the people at that time, Latin, the Vulgate. So in 1580, out comes this interesting image done by monogrammist W. And what do you see here in this image?
Well, it's a total play off of St. Jerome and the study by Durr.
Except that, why, look who's translating the Bible. Look.
Martin Luther.
Martin Luther's translating the Bible. And it's the Durr switched on his side, and now he has become that new leader into the new world. And
complete with that weird gourd in the bishop's hat.
Yeah, it's totally flipped, but you can really see Durr's legacy is great. Durr changes to Lutheranism. It's fascinating to see what happens. And the next time we'll have to talk about what folks in the northern part of Europe will be doing and how they handle no graven images and what they use to get snarky about what's going on. Teach you lessons.
Okay.
I hope that helped.
It's a lot to take in.
Well, one guy.
Jeez.
Marty Luther. He did a good job.
Martin
Luther, Martin Luther King, people that change history. I don't think it's arcane. I think it's remarkable when somebody has that much intent and does a good thing.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was fascinating. Because I always think of the Protestant, it's no more religious images, so it must be landscapes, genre scenes, and portraits and still lifes, but it's not.
Yeah.
Right.
That's some nasty.
It's nasty.
That's like dirty politics, man.
Right.
You're like, oh, it's the church. Everybody's kind of, no, they're not. It's people being people. And Martin Luther will change a little bit, and he won't side with the peasants when they revolt in 1525, and 100,000 people will die, and that'll upset Kate the Colvitz, and she'll do a whole cycle of prints about that peasants' revolt, and we'll get to her, because she was impressed by that too.
Right.
Stuff. It's all a circle.
Stuff and stuff.
Anyway, that's all I got to say about that. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Okay, that brings us to the end of that one. Thank you, as always, to Tru for being my co-pilot on this crazy adventure. I'm having a great time, and I hope you're enjoying listening. As always, you can find the images we talk about over on the show notes page for the episode at platemarkpodcast.com. I always want to thank Michael Diamond for the use of his original music. Also want to put in a plug for the Baltimore Fine Art Print Fair, which is coming up at the end of April in Baltimore, Maryland. You can go over to baltimoreprintfair.com and check out the details there. Tickets are on sale for that, so we hope we'll see you in Baltimore. But as for all of you history of print peoples, or hopsters as we used to call them at the BMA, we will see you next time.